Today's video is sponsored by Conflict of Nations. More about this in a bit. What exactly are the cards that Putin is holding that have led him to raise tensions in Eastern Europe to Cold War levels? What are Russia's strengths in the current conflict with Ukraine? Before we continue, all of us have often focused on the defense capabilities of countries and tried to predict which side would have the upper hand in a hypothetical conflict. Who really has the best armed forces? Is technology providing new game-changing tools that could upset our world order? But do you ever wish you could get involved in more active speculation? Well, today's sponsor is Conflict of Nations, and this video game allows you to do just that. It's a real-time tactical combat game, so you can choose which country you want to lead in a modern global war scenario and engage in combat with up to 128 other players in real time, in games that can take weeks to complete. Once you have an account, you can play on PC or mobile. It features a lot of the modern warfare technology and logistics that we're discussing today, so you can play around with scenarios that could well break out in the near future, as well as replaying conflicts from the last couple of decades and playing through alternative outcomes. Even better, if you click on the link in that description, you can unlock your exclusive gift of 13,000 units of gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. This offer is only available for 30 days, so check it out today. The goal seems clear. Putin wants to restore Russia to political and military greatness. In a past video here on VisualPolitik, we told you how the invasion of Ukraine could become a trap to hamper Russia's future. We even told you how Washington might be looking forward to Russian troops crossing the Ukrainian border. However, it is clear that Moscow has, or at least had, very different calculations. The country has changed a lot over the last 2 decades, and Putin's government feels stronger today than ever. And so, VisualPolitik fans, only time will tell if they are enough. But in this video, we are going to take a close look at the 4 strengths, the 4 trump cards that have led Vladimir Putin to unleash the latest great political military crisis on the European continent. Listen up. The Force Unleashed. When Putin took over the leadership of the Russian Federation on 31st of December 1999, the country's armed forces were not exactly at its best. At that time, the Russian army was little more than an aging, rusty structure whose capabilities were crumbling day by day. For example, the once mighty Soviet nuclear submarine fleet languished, struggling to survive for the sake of survival. The Air Force faced all kinds of calamities. The troops lacked the most basic equipment, and both they and the officers in charge of them lived in run-down and dilapidated houses. To make matters worse, the war in Chechnya had become something of a never-ending nightmare. Let's just say that back then, morale, like military salaries, was at rock bottom. Well, Vladimir Putin tried to improve things, but it was not until 2008 that a real turning point occurred. That year, the Russian army attacked Georgia, a small country in the Caucasus. And you know what? Despite the enormous superiority of forces, the shortcomings of the Russian army were immediately brought into focus. All kinds of problems occurred. For example, ground troops had no direct communication with the Air Force, which led to several serious friendly fire attacks. Tanks and transport vehicles suffered a lot of mechanical breakdowns. Coordination between the various military commands was practically non-existent. There was no precision weaponry, and troop readiness was disastrous. The Georgian War was the most significant turning point for Russia. From that moment on, Vladimir Putin made military reform a national priority. In his view, Russia had to completely rebuild and modernize its military. Well, as we say around here, no sooner said than done. Since 2008, the situation of the Russian military has changed completely. Vladimir Putin has driven a huge process of investment and renewal of the armed forces. Today, the Russian army is smaller, but much more operational and modern. Units have better equipment. Deployment capabilities have multiplied. The Air Force has added hundreds of new aircraft, and the Navy is deploying new Bory-class nuclear submarines. You could say that the transformation has been very significant in practically all areas. But do you want a concrete example? Well, without digging too deep, let's look at the T-72 tanks that have been deployed along the Ukrainian border. These tanks have a new thermal optic system that allows them to be used in combat at night. Then there are the Caliber cruise missiles deployed on ships and submarines in the Black Sea, as well as the Iskander mobile ballistic missiles deployed along the border, which could hit targets almost anywhere inside Ukraine. And these are just a couple of examples, because the truth is that the Russian armed forces have changed radically since Vladimir Putin came to power. This has allowed the Kremlin to multiply its incursions abroad with considerable success. Take, for example, the operations in Crimea and Syria, as well as the rapid deployments in Armenia and Kazakhstan. In fact, Russia has used these interventions to refine its strategies and gain operational and combat experience. This is a key factor when carrying out military operations. And so, according to Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, all ground troop commanders, 92% of Air Force pilots, and 62% of Navy units have battlefield experience. Of course, the Russian military still has many limitations, such as access to state-of-the-art technology or having the backing of a strong economy to finance its development. But despite this, it is clear that the situation today is totally different from that of the year 2000. And so, Putin's first great strength in the Ukrainian crisis is precisely being able to expect that, if necessary, the Russian army will be in a position to make a clean and rapid intervention. This would not only be a significant show of strength, but would also allow them to move very rapidly into the next phase in this whole political military conflict. It is evident that having prepared armed forces greatly increases the number of options, as well as bargaining power. Sure, this may be the most obvious strength, but it is far from the only one, and probably not the most important asset Putin is counting on to try to get his way. Listen up. The Fortress Russia strategy. The economic and financial sanctions with which the United States and the European Union punished Russia after the occupation of Crimea dealt a severe blow to Russia's economy. As we've covered in a past video, the sanctions contributed to shrinking disposable income, as well as a reduction in economic growth and foreign investment in Russia. Well, once again, the West has announced the threat of more and more sanctions. Sanctions that the Russian government hopes they will be able to digest in due course. In order to achieve this, since 2014, they have been making preparations under a strategy that has come to be known commonly as the Fortress Russia plan. And so you see, in 2014, the Russian government understood that international sanctions could cause enormous damage, not only to the Russian economy, but also to the government's own decision-making capabilities. Without resources, it is difficult to have an effective foreign policy. Precisely because of this, the Russian government realized that it had to prepare its economy to be able to withstand new sanctions as much as possible. Therefore, balancing public accounts, increasing its foreign exchange reserves, and reducing dependence on the dollar became fundamental objectives of economic policy. And VisualPolitik community, that's exactly what they have done. For the Kremlin, the top priority has been to prepare the government to be able to withstand the impact of strong international sanctions, if necessary, without limiting, at least in the short term, its ability to act. And so, in recent years, the Russian government has balanced its public accounts and has built up a huge foreign exchange reserve equivalent to more than $600 billion, whilst reducing its foreign debt. Look at this. The idea is that if a conflict with the United States and the European Union escalates, the Russian government can use this huge stash of cash as a lifeline. Now, while it seems like a lot of money, we have to take into account that we are also talking about a country with a population of more than 140 million people. However, Moscow is also counting on rising oil and gas prices to further increase these foreign exchange reserves over the next few years. Russia is much better prepared for sanctions than it was in 2014, at least in terms of its macro indicators. The state sector is in good shape and the financial cushion is large. Natalia Lavrova, chief economist at BCS Financial Group in Moscow. In addition, Russia has also been reducing its exposure to the dollar and increasing the presence that other currencies, such as the euro or the Chinese yuan, have both in its foreign exchange reserves and, above all, in its own trade relations. Check it out. And yes, as we told you in a past video here on VisualPolitik, in the medium and long term, international sanctions could cause enormous damage to the Russian economy. On that issue, there is very little doubt. The medium and long-term impact of driving Russia into financial and economic autarky, as well as the cost to citizens, would be enormous. Potential growth will be much lower without interaction with the world. Elena Rybakova, Deputy Chief Economist, International Institute of Finance. However, we are not talking about the most democratic, free and transparent country in the world. For the Kremlin, the main question is not whether or not the sanctions will doom the Russian economy or the standard of living or the population. Let's say that, in a way, that is the least of their concerns. What is important is whether the government can withstand those conditions without being limited in its operations and its ability to influence, at least for a few years. Well, thanks to this policy, the Fortress Russia plan, the Kremlin hopes to be able to count on a sufficient margin for action, whatever its decision may ultimately be. At the same time, they also hope to be able to convince European governments to adopt a more lukewarm position, especially if the intervention in Ukraine were limited. Because Vladimir Putin has a few more aces up his sleeve, for example, what you might call counter-sanctions. Listen up. Message from Moscow to Europe: don't shoot yourself in the foot. Let's see. I don't think it will surprise anyone if I say that Russia is a very important exporter of commodities, such as gas, oil, fertilizers, aluminium, steel, platinum, gold, and nickel, amongst many other goods. We are talking about supplies that, in many cases, are essential for European companies and economies. This is the case, for example, with gas. The European Union imports more than 40% of all the gas it consumes from Russia. So it follows that, if sanctions were excessively aggressive, they could affect the very access of European economies to all these inputs, such as, for example, gas. Some countries such as Austria, Finland, Poland, and Germany are highly dependent on gas. And take note, because replacing Russian gas is not an easy task. Firstly, because liquefied natural gas, which would be the only real alternative, is much more expensive. And secondly, because today, the producing countries do not have much margin to sell. Europe would have to source gas from the Asian economies and pay through the nose for it. Clearly, this whole scenario is a major deterrent. Sanctions would make trade relations more difficult, while Russia could reduce or even suspend the supply of many raw materials as a means of pressure. In this way, Moscow is convinced that, in the end, the big governments of the European Union will do everything possible to keep things from getting out of hand and apply much more limited sanctions than Washington would like, especially if we're talking about a limited or partial invasion. And take note, because here we can find an important precedent. In 2018, the United States imposed sanctions against Rusal, the leading Russian aluminium company, for its ties to Oleg Deripaska, an oligarch close to the Kremlin. The sanctions caused prices to skyrocket by 30%, affecting all types of industries, from car manufacturers to soft drink can makers. The pressure was so great that just a few months later, Washington decided to lift the sanctions. Well, the thing is that, as it stands, Gazprom, the Russian energy giant, has been curbing gas supplies to Europe in 2021, something that has reduced reserves and put upward pressure on prices. This has contributed to the fact that, according to JP Morgan estimates, Europe's energy bill has doubled since 2019. And remember, we're not just talking about a few euros, but about 500 billion in cost overruns. Yes, you heard correctly, 500 billion annually. You could say that Moscow is using something like game theory. On the one hand, they know that in the medium and long term, they need Europe to continue buying their raw materials. And they know that reducing or suspending supplies could lead, as we told you in a previous video, to huge long-term losses. In the short term, however, things could be very different. The enormous dependence of European economies on many Russian supplies is a pressure factor, which Moscow hopes, or at least hoped, to use to gain a diplomatic triumph. And we're not done yet. Putin still has a fourth card up his sleeve. Listen up. Chinese dragon to the rescue. Let's see. Historically, the Russians and the Chinese have never got along very well. Terribly, in fact. However, in recent years, the situation has changed quite a bit. Few leaders have accumulated as many tete-a-tetes as Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. To give you an idea of their esteem for each other, these two political leaders have sat face to face and rubbed palms more than 40 times. And something that is even more important. According to data out of China, the volume of trade between the two countries exceeded 145 billion in 2021. The Asian giant is already Russia's #1 trading partner, and by 2024, bilateral trade is expected to have exceeded $200 billion. And so, if things turn ugly with the West, Moscow believes that the Chinese economy that holds huge amounts of foreign exchange and devours raw materials like there is no tomorrow could be quite a lifesaver for Russia, at least for avoiding the worst case scenario. I think Putin probably received some assurances from Xi that if a crisis breaks out over Ukraine and the West imposes major sanctions against Russia, then China will stand shoulder to shoulder with Russia. Artyom Lukin, professor of international relations at the Far Eastern Federal University. Of course, this presents two problems. On the one hand, China cannot completely replace Western economies. Economically, a Russia with less West and more China would be much weaker. On the other hand, it would lead the Russian economy to a huge dependence on China, something that, believe me, Moscow is not comfortable with at all. The Kremlin may have little confidence in the Americans, but don't think for a second that they think much differently about the Chinese. Now, they may be relying on the very threat of strengthening ties between China and Russia to act as another deterrent in itself. But there you have it. These are the four major cards with which Vladimir Putin hopes to play this game. The problem for Russia is that, as we told you in a past video, this time the United States seems to have decided to see the hand. And the truth is that Putin's cards, although significant, are not so strong, particularly because in this game, Russia has a lot to lose and very little to gain, exactly the opposite of the US position. Yes, there's no doubt about it, Russia today is much better prepared to withstand the West's political offensive than it was 10 or 15 years ago. But in the long run, sanctions, the search for alternatives to Russian energy, and the military race along the European border would deal a heavy blow to the country. And all for what? Well, basically, for nothing. And perhaps this is what explains why Russia has not yet intervened. If it had really wanted to do so, if Putin had really wanted to invade Ukraine from the beginning, he would have already done so. Russian troops have been ready for many months, and quick action would have been a major advantage at the negotiating table. It would have caught NATO members off guard, so to speak, both militarily and politically. Everything suggests that, far from thinking about Ukraine, Putin wanted to take advantage of this scenario to reinforce Russia's international presence, to send a warning to other countries in his orbit, including, of course, Kiev, and to fracture NATO. And the truth is that, given the initial reactions of countries such as France or Germany, which were in favor of seeking conciliation and even distancing themselves from Washington, Putin may not have been far from getting his way. This time, however, the strong reaction of the United States seemed to have turned the tables. But having said that, it's your turn. Do you think Putin will ultimately invade Ukraine? If so, what kind of scale do you think the operation would have? How should NATO countries react? Do you think Russia would really achieve anything? Leave your comments below. And if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik. And remember that if you want to engage in epic battles and try your hand at world domination, the free online PvP strategy game, Conflict of Nations, is worth checking out. Choose your country, design your strategy, and fight your way to victory. Click on the link in the description to get your free gold and 1 month of premium subscription, but remember that the offer is only available for 30 days. All the best! I'll see you next time.